Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. This week on the show, I am joined by Clay Newcomb to discuss the long hunters of the 18th century, such as Daniel Boone, and what we modern-day deer hunters can learn from them. All right, welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, brought to you by First Light in their Camo for Conservation initiative. I think you know this by now, but if not, a portion of every sale of First Light's whitetail camo pattern, it's called Spectre, a portion of every sale of that stuff goes to the National Deer Association to help them do good things for deer, deer hunters, deer habitat. I love it. So thank you, First Light. And with that said, today's podcast is a good one. We are looking back in history. We're going to look at our predecessors, the deer hunters that in many ways established a foundation for whitetail deer hunting culture in America. We're talking with my buddy Clay Newcomb. He recently had a collaboration with Steve Rinella, released a new MeatEater audiobook called The Long Hunters, 1761 through 1775. This book, this audiobook is what it is. It details the story of folks like Daniel Boone and how these folks traveled across the first far west, the first frontier, and developed a livelihood off of hunting for whitetail deer. And so today I want to bring Clay on to talk about that history, to talk a little bit about Boone and the other guys like him that, I think we have now romanticized and developed a set of mythologies around these first wilderness hunters that so many of us like to dream about and imagine living their lives. What can we learn from these guys? What can we learn from their hunting exploits? What can someone like Daniel Boone teach us about deer hunting? Also, what can they teach us about how to better enjoy the experience and adventure of hunting? And not only that, what can we learn from these guys and the mistakes that they might have made when it came to over-exploiting a resource, over-exploiting a population of wildlife? There's a lot here to unpack. It's a great audiobook that Clay and Steve just released. I hope you'll check it out. Like I said, it's called The Long Hunters, 1761 through 1775. We're going to talk about that and a whole bunch more here on the show with my buddy Clay. I want to give you two quick updates. Number one, we do still have some of our new Wired to Hunt hats over on the MeatEater store. I'm not wearing one right now, but I showed you guys a couple weeks ago. It's got that really cool whitetail illustration on the front. It says Wired to Hunt on the side of the crown. And they're in like a charcoal gray or tan color right now. So going over to the MeatEater store if you've been wanting one of those. And while you're there, I just saw we do still have a few copies of my book, That Wild Country, an epic journey through the past, present, and future of America's public lands. And we've got a few more signed copies of that book available on the store as well. So if you're interested in either of those, you can go to themeateater.com. And if you are not interested in those things, or if you've already got a couple of your own, then just tune in for the rest of my conversation with Mr. Clay Newcomb. All right, here with me now is my pal and the one and only Mr. Clay Newcomb. Welcome back to the show, bud.
Hey, Mark. Great to be here, man.
Man, I appreciate you getting up early to do this. I know it's a cold beginning to the day, so thank you.
-6 is about as cold as it gets around here, and that's what it is right now.
How do what do you guys call yourselves? Arkansans. Arkansans. That's it. Well, how do Arkansans handle this kind of temperature?
Shut down everything possible and just hunker down.
Okay.
I love it, man.
So you're in hibernation mode.
Yeah, a lot of the schools have been canceled and even businesses closed. But we have snow too, and so we just don't have the infrastructure for snow removal like a lot of the northern states where you get this kind of stuff all the time.
Yeah, you hear these nightmare stories about like what happens in Texas when they get a little bit of sleet. Is it kind of like that?
It really, yeah, it is. In Northwest Arkansas, we're a little bit more used to it. Maybe have a little bit more infrastructure. We get snow every year, but not usually extended periods of snow.
Yeah.
But I think the most unique thing about this is just the temperature, just like very cold temperatures for here, which is good. I was talking to a farmer the other day, and he said it keeps everything honest by getting this cold, with warming trends and everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Keeps the fire ants out, and
that's true.
Keeps the riffraff invasives out.
Well, and like we were talking about before we started recording, it's kind of nice just to feel those extremes every once in a while and just remember, like, all right, nature is a force. There's something a little bit stronger than us out there. And going outside, I was just telling you, I went for a run the other day in this stuff, and it was like negative 25 wind chill. And you just have to kind of think, all right, do I have the right clothes on? How long can I be out there without this getting gnarly? Just that kind of little bit of humbling of you in the face of nature. I like. So
it makes me think of what we're about to talk about, the long hunters, and even going back to just our human ancestors that really had to take all this stuff in the face. I mean, it's mind-boggling to me that people could survive without the modern technologies we have. It truly is.
Yeah, that's so true. So you perfect segue to what I wanted to pull you on here today to talk about, which is this new book that you collaborated on with Mr. Steven Ranella, The Long Hunters. But before we get into the book itself, you kind of wrapped up a pseudo long hunt. I don't know, maybe you wouldn't call it that, but a longish hunt yourself going down the Mississippi River. How long were you guys doing that adventure for?
So we set out from Memphis on January the 3rd, and we rode 250 miles down the Mississippi River to south of Greenville and hunted. And we stayed in the same place for a week. Originally, the idea for the film was that we were going to stop multiple places and hunt here and hunt there. And we had to reschedule the trip one time because of illness of a crew member. And when we put the hunt back together for the second time, we pretty much just had one place we could hunt. So we rode 250 miles down the river to our camp, which was a big modern camp. I mean, a nice camp. And no, we did a podcast series back in the summer on the Mississippi River, a 4-part series, and it was fascinating to me. It was I didn't know a lot about the Mississippi, really. And honestly, a lot of people don't. I mean, even people that live on the banks of it don't. I find most of them don't really know the deeper history of the river. And I set out a year ago, 2 years ago, like, man, I need to know about this river. And we did this big research project and podcast. And when I did that, I said, I want to go down the Mississippi, and kind of the sweet spot for Mississippi wilderness, quote unquote, is from Memphis to Vicksburg. And I mean, truly, aside from river improvements by the Corps, channel improvements by the Corps of Engineers, the river is not that much different than it would have been visually from what Mark Twain and what Davy Crockett and what all these, like every American hero of old times went down and saw. I mean, the river's pretty wild. And so it was a really unique hunt. We had some great deer hunting, Mark. Holy cow. That part of Mississippi is probably, it's got to be some of my favorite deer hunting of all time. And this
is the famed Delta deer hunting down there, right? Where you got to?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, so we hunted the first week of January, basically, and it would have been akin to hunting the last week of November.
Okay.
The rut is really mid-December through mid-January. So, I mean, we were absolutely seeing bucks chasing, bucks locked down with does, bucks cruising. I mean, it was really neat.
And I saw Brent got a good one.
He did. He killed a nice, we didn't score it, but 130 to 135 inch deer for sure. And awesome. I was bow hunting. If I'd carried a rifle, which it was legal to carry, I would have killed a real nice buck the first day I was there.
Wow.
But I loved to bow hunt there. I killed two 2 does, and had the time of my life doing it,
That's great. So you spent all this time researching, doing the podcast series, learning about the Mississippi River and the history of that place, and then you got to float down the river and see
Yep.
it all. What was that like? Like when you go down 250 miles down the river through this as close to wilderness as you can get at corridor, were the whole time, are you able to be in the present, or the whole time when you're going on that journey, are you thinking about this thing you learned about and that thing you learned about and all of that? Like, what does that look like for you after getting that context?
It was both things. The primary thing, though, and I think the thing that I was after was to kind of confront and experience the river. And when you're on the Mississippi River, the primary thing on your mind is being safe. I mean, it's a big woolly river, and all you hear people talk about that are on it a lot is how dangerous it is and how you just have to be on your toes all the time. I'm not an experienced riverman. Brent Reeves is. Brent spent 26 years as a duck guide, partly on the Arkansas River, so he was used to navigating big rivers. He's the only reason that I was confident in taking on the trip. But that being said, I drove the boat probably 200 of the 250 miles. Barge traffic is a big problem. I mean, that's or the biggest challenge probably, because you have these huge, just unbelievably big barges pushing as many as 80 containers down the river, create huge wakes. But also you have to stay inside the channel, which is marked. But so to answer your question, I think I probably was dealing with the same things that anyone would have at any time. There's Mark Twain wrote a famous book called The Mississippi River, and he was a cub pilot, meaning he was second in command of a steamboat going up and down the river for several years, and he devoted. Well, I've heard it said it's some of America's greatest prose, but he devoted several chapters to talking about navigating the Mississippi River. And it's just fascinating, all the things. And what he had to do was vastly more difficult than what we had to do because of modern technology. So I think I was confronting a fear, overcoming inside of riding down that river. Truly was. But also, I was thinking about Davy Crockett was about right here when he crashed a boat just south of Memphis. I was thinking about the flood pulse of the river, which that's what makes the Mississippi River so unique among rivers in the world, is that we have 1,000-mile stretch of this category of river in size, that there are no dams, which the only river that has that long of a stretch, damless stretch, is the Amazon. All the other big rivers of the world have been dammed. So that creates a natural flood pulse because of the levees, which the 1,100 miles of levees on the Mississippi River is the greatest civil engineering feat, really, arguably in American history. And because of those levees, the flood pulse of the river is natural. Like it allows the water to rise, and that creates an incredible fishery. So, I just could nerd out on it and just loved it. But I'm a terrestrial man. Like I'm from the mountains. I'm least comfortable on water. And that's kind of why I wanted to do it. And man, it was no joke doing it in the winter. Holy cow. Yeah, originally we were doing it in November. And in that part of the world in November, it's pretty mild. River would be low. Temperatures would be, probably even getting into the 60s and 70s. When we did it in January, it was cold and it rained, and it was a lot of fun. It
a real
truly
adventure.
was. We did.
What you kind of did here, studying up, researching, exploring the history of the Mississippi, and then going and experiencing it, is kind of analogous to what you've got here with the Long Hunter book, in which someone can listen to this book, experience the history, and then go out and deer hunt themselves. And I'm wondering if, in learning the history of our whitetail hunting predecessors, if that in some way changes our experience or can change our experience now today as modern day whitetail hunters. That's a question I have. Do you think that is something that happens? Like, how does a historical perspective change our present day experience? Why is this kind of historical perspective maybe important?
You nailed it, Mark. When this book was being researched, as the details of what we talked about just kind of unfolded, man, I was like, this book is foundational to every American deer hunter. And you wouldn't think it. I mean, you wouldn't think the guy down the road that deer hunts one weekend a year, and why would this be relevant to him? How would this be relevant to some of the guys that we know that are highly managing land for killing 5+-year-old whitetails with big antlers?
Mm-hmm.
Every single piece of the whitetail world that we love today, you can trace back to parts of this story of the American deerskin trade. If an alien came from another planet and showed up on Earth and he saw Mark Kenyon pass up a whatever kind of deer and shoot this other deer with bigger antlers and be thrilled about it, the alien would be like, what? Why didn't he just shoot the one that came by first so he didn't have to sit there for that long? He's after the meat. He's after the hide. He's after, those horns literally do nothing. That assignment of cultural value goes back deep in history. And that doesn't necessarily go to the deerskin trade, but it spans it. That was a step after the deerskin trade. The deer were initially sought after for their hides because of a global demand. And we talk extensively about that in the book. Where did this demand come from? Who was using deer skins? And so there was this value on the deer. And then later, as sport hunting arose, that value, that legacy of the long hunters translated into people trying to kill big bucks. We were no longer trying to kill 350 deer a year or 500 deer a year. And it kind of morphed into this sport hunting where we would culturally value a bigger antler buck. But really, the value of that deer really started back during that time. But no, I think it. No, I've heard some great quotes on why history is important, and history just adds so many dimensions to the present. I mean, to just show up and do what we do and be a human and not have any understanding of history is really, in a way. I mean, I personally feel like it's kind of irresponsible, and I don't say that from a high and lifted up place of thinking that I do. I'm not a trained historian. A lot of the stuff that I'm researching and learning, I'm learning for the first time as an adult. I mean, it's not like you're just born knowing stuff. Mm-hmm. But every time I research something like the Mississippi River or the long hunter stuff, I'm like, holy cow, I cannot believe that I didn't know this before. Yeah. It seems it's that's the way it feels to me. It's like, this almost seems irresponsible that I didn't know this stuff. And that's what's so fascinating and fun about it. And the research that was done on this book, it was never before compiled data. I'm not saying that people didn't know this data, but nothing has remotely been put together where we were taking all this information. You would have found bits and pieces of this information in uncountable sources. So it's not like we learned something that was never known. We absolutely put together information that was never compiled together. So in that 6 hours of the Long Hunter's book, you'll hear information that you just couldn't find anywhere else, which is really neat. And you got to give credit to Steve Ranella and Randall Williams. It was Steve was it was his idea. Basically, most of historical hunting practices were covered by historians and academics that were not hunters. And so they often did not answer the questions that you and I would have When
Yeah.
we learn about a Boone on a long hunt and how he processed deer and where he hunted and why he hunted and what he was looking for and what the deer were eating. And so there's, you know what I'm talking about. But if you read academic literature, it's like you're reading something that, yeah, it has details, it has important stuff, but it is not from someone that is asking the right questions for
Right.
people like us. And so that's what Steve wanted to do. Is he said, hey, let's answer the questions that we're all interested in and make a book like that. So the angle was coming from a different place. And it wasn't necessarily built for hunters. Anybody could listen to it and be entertained. It's not per se made for hunters, but that was the mentality, is to go deeper into it. So, yeah.
So for someone who hasn't listened to the book yet, let's just lay out a very Cliff Notes explanation here of just who we're talking about here in the first place. So give me your Cliff Notes on who the long hunters were, and then what this experience that they would go out and have would look like, just to give us like a starting point for a few of these conversations here.
So the name the Long Hunters was pulled from the literature, and this, back in their day, they were called just by a few people, often as history does, just kind of tag on to somebody the name Long Hunters. So in the Long Hunt described men, people, groups that went into the woods and stayed for extended periods of time. The most famous long hunt was Boone's 2-year long hunt into Kentucky, when he stayed for 2 years away from home in Kentucky. The book is titled The Long Hunters 1761 to 1775. There was basically a 14-year period that was the heyday of what would become America's story of the Long Hunters. They weren't Americans at that time. There was no America. It was the British colonies. And the British colonies were divided by a geopolitical border of the Appalachian Mountains. So there's imagine the 13 colonies on the East Coast, and then the Appalachian Mountains, which created a border. Beyond the Appalachian Mountains was not America. It was not the British colonies. It was owned by Native American tribes. It was owned by the Shawnees and all the tribes in different places, but it was also claimed by the French, the Spanish, and the Long Hunters were people that were not trying to seek glory. They were not trying to become the legendary forefathers of modern American hunters. They were guys destitute, trying to make a living. And the global deerskin trade, which was primarily based out of England, there was a high demand for deerskin. And everybody knows I got a pair of deerskin gloves right here on my desk.
Those are nice.
Deerskin is incredibly supple and thin and makes incredible garments. Like cow leather is much thicker, tougher. And, you don't see that many people wearing cow leather like as an on-skin garment. But the deerskin was, compared to the denim, it was the denim of the 1700s. It was used that often.
Yeah.
So there's global demand. It was just like the perfect storm. During that time, there was also bovine disease that had struck down in Europe, and there was a leather shortage. And so they were trying to find ways to extract resource from the colonies. They had these colonies, and what way can we extract resource? Man, the deerskin trade. And prior to that, as early as the early 1700s, the French and the English were employing Native American tribes heavily in deerskin. So by the time our what would become this mythological group of we see them as Americans. We see Boone and Casper Maner and Simon Kent and all these guys as Americans. By the time they showed up, Native Americans had been trading deerskins for 70 years. And but these guys would out of destitute financial situations would trespass into primarily Kentucky, but eastern Tennessee, Ohio, and they would go on long hunts and gather deer skins for a season. And when they would gather enough bounty, they would bring the hides back across the Appalachian Mountains, often through the Cumberland Gap. Some of the most famous long hunts started and ended at the Cumberland Gap. People going through it, going on long hunts, coming back over and selling their hides. And it's easy to see why they could do it when you understand the finances of it. They could make a hefty living in 3 or 4 months. So these guys that had no money, no land, no way to make a living, they weren't shopkeepers, they weren't manufacturers, they weren't, they had no profession per se. They could go and I would equate it to they could in 3 or 4 months make $80,000 or $90,000, which they didn't make that much, but in today's world, like they could make a pretty good living. And so they were willing to risk everything to do that. And so they trespassed into land they weren't supposed to be. They were often killed, got in skirmishes with Native Americans, had their stuff stolen. I mean, some of the wildest stories are of Boone and many, many others. But, they would have worked a whole winter and, you just to get all these hides. And then on their way back, Native Americans show up, take all their hides, and all their work is just they're back to zero, but they were the ones trespassing in the first place. So we made it real clear about that we have mythologized these guys into heroes, but I mean, really, they were kind of just normal dudes. Now, what I can respect and marvel at is the physical hardships that they endured.
Yeah.
And then truly what they would have known. It'd be interesting to put a Daniel Boone in Michigan with you, Mark, today and just be like, hey, Daniel, go see if you can kill a big buck,
Yeah.
And, would he be able to? I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I know he would, certainly, but would you with what you know about deer movement and how to look at the land and, but certainly these guys, for what they were after, for what they were doing, they would have been as skilled as anybody on the earth at doing their job,
Yeah.
And
so is Daniel Boone still? You correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's fair to say that Daniel Boone would be your favorite character within this era. Maybe it seems like you've talked about in your podcast series, he was the one that maybe stood out above all else. But if I'm wrong on that, correct me. But my follow up to that is, if that's true, who is one other long hunter from this era other than Boone that the rest of us should know? Because we all know Boone, we all know Crockett. Who's someone else that you guys talk about in this book that really deserves some recognition?
Well, Boone is maybe the most fascinating part of this. And in Steve's section, I think he did a really good job of describing, we've got no choice but to love Boone, because in the book, Steve described it as, he said, imagine a stage and it's black, and a spotlight suddenly turns on, and the spotlight is illuminating Boone. But the stage is full of people. It's full of people potentially of equal exploits, of equal skill, with equal stories and lives. But the one that we can see is Boone. And as the spotlight fades out from its epicenter, you can see part of the guy that's standing next to him. You can see the guy next to him fairly well, but the guy next to that guy you can hardly see, and it fades into blackness. Like, that's Boone. For whatever reason, we just know so much about Boone. It had to do with him getting famous at just the right time, and we know exponentially more about Boone than any other long hunter. But Casper Maner, is a guy we talk a lot about in the book, and it's kind of wild how, I mean, we know a lot about the guy, but not even remotely what we know about Boone. And Steve did a good job of talking, kind of leveling the playing field and saying, we know about Boone. It's hard to think this book isn't about Boone, but there were countless others that were like him. We just like have 2 or 3 sentences about that, you start putting the dots together and you see their names mentioned here and here and here and here, but there's just very little. But I would say Casper Maner, Simon Kenton, the Wallen brothers. There were many others, and we talk about those guys in the book.
Is there anything about Maner that stands out that makes him interesting? There's one story I remember hearing in the beginning of the book that was just an interesting one about him crossing paths with Boone. But why do you bring up Maner? What about him was of interest to you?
Mark, I told you this. You're pinning me down here. It's been a while since I've these books come out, and then you kind of forget about them. And I actually was a little too fearful to listen to the audiobook after we recorded it.
Oh, it turned out good, man. You should listen.
You're catching me with my.
Well, let me tell you my favorite story then about Maner.
There you go. That's Mark. Why don't you tell me your favorite story about Casper Maner?
I just like this story about he was out there on a long hunt himself, somewhere in Kentucky, I guess it was, and he had been on a hunt, and he was out there stalking a critter or searching for a deer, I'm sure, and he heard this sound, this strange sound that did not make sense to him. He couldn't put a finger on what this thing was he was hearing because it was so outside of the norm of what he would typically hear when he's out here hunting. And so he starts approaching the sound, and the closer and closer he gets, he realizes it's a human. And then he realizes it's someone singing, and he gets out through the brush, and then there's someone lying down on his back singing out loud, and the person lying on his back singing out loud in the middle of the Kentucky wilderness is Daniel Boone. I mean, what a interesting colliding of the worlds there.
See, Mark, your favorite story about Casper Maner is ultimately about Boone.
That is so great point. That illustrates your original point perfectly.
Yeah.
That's such a great analogy. There was
a lot of there's a lot of that story. There's a lot of speculation about it. Robert Morgan, one of Boone's, my favorite Boone biographer, he thinks, and this is just him analyzing what he's learned about Boone and knowing what he knows about the frontier and the wilderness. He thinks that Boone knew those guys were there and was kind of putting on a show in a way. That's what Robert Morgan thinks. I don't necessarily buy it, but Morgan says, in the Kentucky wilderness, when you were trying to be as incognito as possible, you didn't have fires during the day because you didn't want a pillar of smoke going up and the Shawnees seeing that you were trespassing on their land. Why would he be so careless as to be yelling and screaming in the wilderness? And Morgan also felt like Boone was kind of a showman in a way, and not in a negative way, but he knew how to portray the image of Daniel Boone that was beneficial to his legacy, which I don't necessarily. I think it's speculative, but I think the man probably was just lonely, and what we know of Boone, he was a charismatic fellow, loved life, and he'd been in the wilderness alone for so long. I think he was just singing.
Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that. You mentioned how something that makes this book unique compared to anything else about the long hunters in the past is that it's asking the questions that someone like us who is particularly interested in the hunting side of things would be asking of these guys. And so I love the fact that you guys actually cover in the story, you actually talk about how these guys hunted in detail. As you dove into this, Clay, both this project and your project about Crockett or Boone, is there anything that you learned about how these guys hunted that we as modern deer hunters today could benefit from if we were to be a little bit more like them in this way or that way or something? Is there something we can learn tactically from Boone or Mansker or Crockett that would help us as deer hunters today? Is there anything that comes to mind?
You know, they did a lot of still hunting, slowly moving through the woods. I think they never hunted out of tree stands. They set Saltlicks. I'm certain that Boone, we never heard, I don't know that there's any documentation of this, but you just know it had to happen. A still hunt, you would have to start out from your camp. You wouldn't have, he wouldn't have been traveling for hours in the dark before daylight to get to his spot. Most likely probably started right at daylight and hunted out from his camp and maybe head to a specific place. But you know that he would have been looking for sign, and that he probably would have waited and actually just set and waited in places for long periods of time. But the details of how they hunted, I felt like was pretty low, because the people that were recording these things often weren't real serious hunters. But yeah, it would have been interesting to talk to Boone. I can't say that that's the one part of their story that to me is kind of vague. Now we basically know that they slipped through and hunted, and when they would shoot a deer, they would hang it up in a tree, mark where it was, and they would just continue to hunt and kill as many deer as they could in a single day, which could be as many as 20. And then they would come back through and take the hide off of the deer, and most often leave all the meat. They would take the meat they needed to eat, but there was an incredible amount of waste. But they would take the deer hides and preserve them, keep them in a cache at their camp. And so, no, you don't hear them talking about sign. You don't hear the long hunters talking about antler size. You hear occasionally guys talk about, mass crop causing animals to be concentrated. Did you hear anything in there, Mark, that are you tipping? Did you hear anything? Question back to you.
Yeah, I think the one thing that stood out to me was their emphasis on Saltlicks, and right there's like a historical use of a resource by wildlife, and we shouldn't be surprised by this. I don't think the fact that hunters 200, 300 years ago would have keyed in on the same kinds of things that we're looking for today, which is what's the thing that the deer want to come back to time and time again, and then key in on that. So I thought that was very interesting that there's a story in there, or multiple stories, about how these long hunters knew where these Saltlicks were. They would go back to them time and time again, and there was sign of other hunters doing the same thing. So there's a story about, I can't remember who it was, but there was Mansker and a group came back to a Saltlick they'd hunted the year previous, and then they saw a sign that some other hunting party had been there and wiped out the deer herd that had been using that Saltlick. And then there's a different Saltlick that I think that they had found Clovis points in. So sign of hunters from thousands of years ago hunting at these Saltlicks. And so, and now today in 2024, I'm sure there are people where it's legal hunting artificial Saltlicks. And if there are any natural ones out there, I'm sure you would find deer still utilizing them today. So it's interesting that some things stay the same, despite the technology we have now, despite the knowledge base we have now. There are some core things when it comes to understanding wildlife habits that Boone was keying in on, that folks 14,000 years were keying in on, and that we can key in now today. That's interesting to me.
Yeah. There was multiple unique stories, but there was a story of a guy that went to a salt lick, a known salt lick, and was tucked in behind a tree, maybe even in a hollow tree close to the salt lick. And a group of Native American hunters, Shawnees, came in, and he watched them set up to hunt the salt lick, just like him. They didn't know he was there. And he just hunkered down and stayed there and basically watched them hunt until they left. And, if they would have discovered him, most likely it wouldn't have been good for him. They talked about how the salt licks were it was the meeting place of wildlife, but it was also the meeting place of people, because that's where people were after the animals. It was the most concentration. When you think about the eastern deciduous forest, just for the sake of we know it wasn't fully canopied. We know there was grassland savannas, and it wasn't 100% canopy, big forest. But for the sake of this thought, it was way more forest than there is today. Today we use topographic features, or we use vegetative features to hunt deer. We use funnels, strips of funnels between fields, between ag fields, between subdivisions, whatever. They wouldn't have had near the features that we would have today, the vegetative features to hunt deer. And so they would have been looking for ways to key in on where are the deer, and they were congregating at these salt licks. And there are some huge salt licks naturally, and they're still there today. It's still salty, but they're not wilderness, so there's not animals using them. But Big Bone Lick, and they had all these salt licks named, and bison would use it, elk would use it, deer would use it, everything would use the salt lick. And that was sitting a lick was a big way to hunt. It would have, man, it would have been so interesting if Boone had been interviewed by a modern sport deer hunter. We would know an entirely different collection of information from him. I would have been like, man, when do you think the best time to kill a deer is? And he'd
November
be like,
7th, he'd say.
Yeah. Or time of day, would he have had this idea that you have to hunt morning and evening and midday isn't that great? Part of that is an artifact of just living in the modern world. We get a couple hours in the morning to hunt, and then we go about and do our day or go to work or whatever. Would he have been like, I never really thought of it, but I kill deer all day long. And these would have been primarily unpressured deer, not. It would have been interesting to see how they would have acted back in. Would they have been just like our whitetail today, that would have been hyper spooky, or could you get into pockets of deer that just hadn't seen people in so long that they were tolerant, or maybe less tolerant of people? Yeah. I would ask him about when would you kill deer. I would ask him about shot placement. It'd been like, he's not listened to the Wired to Hunt podcast. He's not listened to, all these people. He might have been like, man, I shoot him right in the head, Clay. Head shoot every one of them. And it's like, really? Why not shoot him through the lungs? Oh man, that's for the sissies, Yeah. I don't know. He probably would have had some very, very surprising things.
Yeah.
And Mark Kenyon, the other thing I know that would have surprised us is he would not have been into scent control at all.
Yeah.
Am I right? Am I right?
You're right. You are 100% right. And he certainly killed deer despite it. So you can do it. You can do it. Play the wind, Clay. Play the
wind. That's right.
We talked about this, you and I, when we were down in Arkansas together a few years ago, when I came down to hunt with you, just kind of talking about this whole idea of the long hunt, and a hunt being more just than heading out to a tree and shooting something, but instead a larger experience that's days on end, that involves, not just the taking of game, but it involves the navigation, the exploration, the surviving out there, all that kind of stuff. And it seems like this era in stories of people like Boone fascinate people in part because of that, because of this experience out there. And I'm curious if your thoughts or if your fascination has changed at all or been colored at all by this latest project, by this new deep dive you've done, or after having done all the work on the Bear Grease podcast about these things. What are your thoughts on this now, on this way of living? Do you want to do more of this kind of thing yourself? Is there something that we as deer hunters now today could benefit from if we took more of a long hunter type philosophy into the woods with us on occasion? This is a lot to throw at you, but
it's a fair question. I think the older I get, I sense a coming change that, when I was in there would probably been a heyday in my bow hunting career when my goal was just to kill as many deer as I legally could. And that's what I enjoyed. And that has not diminished. I still just enjoy killing deer, eating deer in whatever way I'm doing it. If I'm just going out for a couple hours in the evening here close to home, or if I'm traveling in some exotic place that's a managed property, like I still enjoy that. But the older I get, there's a bigger space in my need to not just go and extract a resource, but to experience a wild place, to experience it. And sometimes I think as modern deer hunters, we don't do that. We kind of extract. We've made a challenge out of extraction, technical extraction of a resource from a landscape, and that's fun. Like you understand. I'm in that 100%. Boat and love it. Absolutely love it. The older I get, the bigger the space in me becomes that I want to experience wildness. I want to challenge myself as a woodsman, even though I'm not a bushcraft guy. Like I don't want to wear buckskins. I don't care about starting fires with flint. I think it's cool. That's not what I'm talking about. But like, for instance, this year, the only buck I killed this year, I killed on really a mini long hunt, Mark, in Arkansas. Packed my mule, me and my buddy Mo Shepherd, who's kind of a kindred spirit of mine, buddy of mine. We went in and planned to stay. We could have stayed as many as 5 days, and went back into a spot that was hard to get to, camped, and hunted out from our camp. And it was in the moment, it's one of those things that you're like, what are we doing? I could have driven to Missouri and bought an over-the-counter tag and like walked in somewhere and probably killed a deer already. But it was an incredible adventure, truly was. Yeah. And now I've already lost some track of your original question.
Well, it was you're onto it, which was just, is there value, or have you found any increased interest in going into a hunt more in the style of the long hunter? So exactly what you said. Yeah. Rather than now they did go into it with extraction as their goal, but their goal required a longer experience. We're kind of role playing a little bit, I guess you could say, to get that kind of experience. So having a bigger experience, having an experience that's more about, it's less about can I kill a big deer, more about can I go somewhere I'm interested in, can I learn something new, can I stretch myself as an outdoorsman, can I immerse myself in this place and everything it has to offer. And that's what it sounds like you've been doing more and more, and I can relate to that too. I've had a desire to focus more on those hunting adjacent things versus just like, do I kill the thing I want? It's becoming more and more important for me did I have the experience I want in the kind of place I want with the people I care about? That's becoming more important to me. And I wonder if that's a little something we can take from these stories.
Yeah. And I don't think they're mutually exclusive.
Agreed.
Because, you get the idea that, oh, well, these guys are just, you might hear what I'm saying and say, oh, Clay just likes camping and probably doesn't kill very many deer. I mean, no, I'm looking for a specific deer taken out of the place that I want to be. And that will be one of the most, well, I mean, even the deer I killed this year wasn't a big deer, but that's a really valuable deer. But to go in and be a successful hunter, I mean, to me, going on a hunt like I'm talking about, not killing a deer is not a success. I struggle with being like, well, I'm just here for the experience. No, I'm here to kill a deer. And but so I think you can combine the two.
Yeah.
And it's just what you're interested in. I mean, I think hearing other people talk sometimes shapes what shapes us and makes us interested. Like, for instance, I think the reason long before I knew anything, so to speak, or anything of detail about Daniel Boone, my buddy James Lawrence was essentially doing long hunts back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And he had no concept of history. His idea, the way he hunted and what he did was so similar to the long hunters. It's unreal. And he came by it honest. He wouldn't have known anything about history, but literally they were that close to that era that's just the way he hunted. I mean, he took horses back into wilderness and would just hunt solo as long as he could. Never climbed a tree, still hunted, never wore camo, never, I mean, shock pouch deer back to his horse. I mean, nobody told him that was cool. He just thought that's the way you're supposed to hunt. And and now when I see Boone and learn about the long hunters, I'm like, James, like, you learned this from them. You may not know you learned it from them, but you did. You know, I mean, it was just
that's
passed
pretty cool.
down. Yeah. So, and that's romantic to me. So that's, as much as I'm influenced by Boone, I'm influenced by people like James Lawrence, and I just have a lot of respect for those guys. Again, I love hunting the way that we hunt in modern times. I mean, no doubt. I mean, this where I was hunting in Mississippi was a pretty modern hunt, really. But I also just have something for the hard way.
All right. Here's something that I'm challenged by. You talked about how this whole idea of this kind of hunting, of this era, of these people, we've kind of romanticized it, right? You just said that you've kind of felt that way. And I think a lot of us do, right? We look back on it and it seems we glorify it, we romanticize it. It seems fascinating to us for so many reasons. I mean, there's countless stories and American folk heroes from this area, right? But these folks were the perpetrators of maybe one of the most catastrophic crimes against wildlife in the history of the world. When you look at the market hunters, both with deer and buffalo and so many other species across North America, were nearly wiped off the face of the earth by this group of folks trying to make ends meet. We almost lost white-tailed deer. We almost lost buffalo. We almost lost so many critters. So how do you, or how do we square that, in that we have canonized, we have made heroes of people who almost wiped out the wildlife that we care so much about today, who did something that if it was done today, we would look at them as the worst crooks in town. We would look at them as like the people burning down the house that we live in. But now we look at them today as heroes. How do you make sense of that? How do you square that?
That's a well stated question, Mark, and an accurate one, in that these guys were a part of a vast squander of wildlife resource. And I think the short answer is that luckily at the end wildlife won. Like if today there were no deer, if literally white-tailed deer were hunted to extinction, or we only could go see them in zoos, I think we would not be talking about the long hunters in the way that we do. Absolutely not. If there were no bison, we would be talking about these people different. But just the way the cards came out, we do have them. And in a way, you can trace back the saving of American wildlife to these guys. Like I look at it as just one big story. I look at it as one big story. Because of a market value, there was cultural value assigned to hunting wildlife. That was the original value of it. That was worth money. You could feed your family. You could put shoes on your children's feet, and that deer had value, and you sought after it because you could access the resource of it. That happened so much that there was a incredible wanton slaughter of wildlife in America for 150 years. True story. But because of that value that was initially kind of a maybe not so righteous value, that translated into the same people, the hunters being the ones who saw that value. Roosevelt, all these guys in the late 1800s that started the Boone Crockett Club, that consciously decided we are going to shift the value system away from commercial market hunting onto adding value to older age animals. We're not going to take away hunting access. We're going to keep hunting access in the hands of the people so that they'll have vested interest in this resource. And we're going to save wildlife by, this strategic hunting. And then later it would be habitat funded through hunting. And it all goes back to a man wanting a deer, a man wanting a bison. And though the motivation was out of control, it was untethered back in those days, that original desire, that E.O. Wilson has a book called Biophilia, which is he believes that there's an innate thing inside of man that loves animals. And, the love of that animal comes from a lot of different places, but almost exclusively it's so we can exploit them as a resource for us. And so that's a not a great picture, but yeah, we have to condemn these guys for the wanton waste that they inflicted on America. But there were different scales of it, just like today. I mean, there were people who were shooting bison out of train car windows just to watch them fall.
Yeah.
There were also plains tribes that were killing bison kind of in traditional ways and contributing to the market, the commercial market. There were egregious wildlife crimes by today's standards. And even then there were people that were like, man, this is bad. One of my favorite books of all time is this wild sports book by Frederick Gerstacker, who was in Arkansas between 1837 and 1842. German guy, came over here. All through this book, he says, holy cow, these Americans are wasteful. They just kill everything.
Yeah.
And he did too, though. He was right there with them, market hunting. And
interesting.
So it's a tough spot, but if you kind of view it as one big picture, and you can't, I mean, historical revision is so tough. Yeah. I'd have been right there with them, Mark. I mean, there's no way that I could say that I would have been like, well, you know what, boys, we should probably just kill 1 or 2 deer each every year and save.
Well, there was a certain ignorance to their situation, right? I don't think anyone out there realized the impact they were having. They did not realize the finite nature of the resource to the degree that it was. And I think a lot of people for a long time thought these were infinite resources.
Yes.
That, there was no end to it. And so that doesn't necessarily excuse them, but to your point, it's hard to, judge someone by our standards and knowledge today when they did not have the luxury of that knowledge and context then.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a tricky thing to try to make sense of though now. When you look back on that era of market hunting and the crash of wildlife populations, and then, what happened after, what's the lesson that you take from that? What's the lesson we can take from that?
I think it's stay humble, because history is going to judge you for what you're doing today, that you're fully convinced is right and ethical and good. And we will look back on stuff we're doing today with wildlife and go, holy cow, how was Mark Kenyon a part of that? I mean, it's going to happen. It's going to happen. And so to me, it's just stay humble. I mean, like, you think of all the challenges that we have in wildlife today, chronic wasting disease. There may come something that in the future that we realize we've been doing so wrong inside of it that will be so evident that unless someone was really paying attention 70 years from now, they would just think, man, those guys were so reckless, just reckless. But here we are sitting here today with all the information of the best science, and we're kind of like, golly, we don't really know exactly what to do. We have some ideas. To me, that's the biggest thing is just stay humble. I mean, our motivations of humans change so much. I mean, it's hard to picture what, should the earth persist, that in 150 years they would say about this generation, when it comes to how we manage wildlife. And perhaps we'll be the heroes, or perhaps we'll be we're a part of some big movement that we can't even see right now.
I guess that's usually the case, right? You don't know what history book you're in the moment. They'll be writing those stories 50 years from now or 100 years from now. That's a very interesting thing to ponder. So there have been some renewed calls to put a price on wildlife again, specifically meat. There have been some calls for there have been some calls for a need to have a market hunt again, in particular for white-tailed deer in some places where not enough deer are being killed, or where there are issues with disease and calls to try to reduce the population, and folks saying, man, if we don't incentivize people to do it, it's not going to get done. And so some folks have said, hey, we should do that again. We should allow people to sell the excess meat or something. We have to incentivize it somehow. When you hear that, knowing what you know, having researched and studied the history of market hunting, what is your take on that, if you have any at all? Does that seem reasonable to you? Does that worry you? What do you think?
It's actually the first I've heard of a call for that, Mark. So I haven't heard that. Is that a legitimate thing? Like, there are people that have power that are saying this, or just the internet crowd?
There are, I wouldn't say people with real power yet. Like, I'm not talking government officials pitching it, but there are folks within our community and folks within the wildlife management community who have talked about that as like, hey, do we need to go back down that road?
Yeah. That's a tough one. I mean, incentivizing killing deer is it's something we've got to do in some places, and considering that the deer meat is so healthy, it's such a clean meat. It's honestly what the world is after in a lot of ways. I just got some venison sticks from Hawaii, from wild killed axis deer in Hawaii. Did you get any of those, Mark?
I think I'm supposed to be getting some, but I haven't got them yet.
And my kids immediately saw the labeling and said 100% wild venison. Like, what's up, Dad? Like, they're like, North American Model of Wildlife Conservation. You can't sell wildlife. And we kind of quickly found out, well, they're axis deer, which are invasive. So somehow they're regulating killing them and USDA processing them and selling them. I don't know. I really don't have an answer, Mark. I don't. I mean, yeah, it would kind of be it would definitely go against the grain. Probably like in the 70s or 80s and 90s when they started encouraging us to kill does, and all our grandpas were like, we're never going to kill a doe deer. That's,
Right.
we're going to shoot spike bucks we'll shoot everyone we see, but no does. And now we realize how wrong that was.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, man. I don't know. It would have
Yeah.
to be highly regulated. I mean, there's probably a way you could do it. Like if you could say everybody in the state of Missouri can legally sell 7 doe deer at this USDA processor, and get $75 per deer, so you could make an extra, $500 a year. I don't know. People would exploit it. People would. I mean,
Yeah,
there'd be people that'd be making a living off of it, and taking everybody's.
Mhm.
I mean, it would just be so hard to regulate. But then again, if deer numbers get so high in places and disease is a problem, it's like, would it be better to do that or to hire government assassins that go in and kill deer, or the ridiculousness of deer contraceptives, where these people are going in and tranquilizing deer? That's just unreal.
Yeah.
So I don't know. That may be conversations that we have in the future.
Yeah, I don't know either. And I haven't, gone deep down that road of inquiry yet, but it's something you start hearing tossed around, and it's a worrisome thing. Like, there's that slippery slope worry looking back on what happened last time. But who knows? Like you said, you bring up a great point. All of these things will be judged by future generations. We don't really know the right answer right now. We don't know what they're going to say, but all you can do is make the best decision with the best information you have at hand, and a good set of intentions, and let the chips fall where they may.
I think the biggest thing that we will give to future generations is modern hunting and all the criticism that it takes, even from the inside. We are adding monetary value to wild places and preservation of wild places. I'm even talking about I'm primarily even talking about private land. Like, I was on the Mississippi River, and the land inside the levees of the Mississippi River is incredibly valuable. I mean, probably some of the most valuable ground in America. And it has that kind of wild value, which there's 1,000 ways to look at that. Some could view that as an atrocity, because access is not something you can get inside the levees of the Mississippi River. I mean, it's closed down tight, private land. And but the way I look at it is that land at one time was primarily owned by timber companies who were managing that land solely for timber and making money. Today, a lot of that timber company land has now gone into private hands and is now being heavily managed for wildlife. And it's so valuable because of its recreational hunting value. That land will probably never go back into the hands of timber companies. And not that timber companies are the villain, but I'm making a point that land being managed exclusively for wildlife is perhaps better than land being exclusively managed for financial gains of the forestry industry, which I'm pro.
Yeah.
Cut them down. I'm pro logging. You hear what I'm saying? But we're adding value to keeping wild places intact because of recreational hunting. I mean, because
100%.
I mean, there's land all around me right now, farms that are being bought, subdivided, divided up into 5-acre plots. Our buddy Matt Cook, just a friend of ours at MeatEater, he bought a golf course up in Michigan and turned it back into a place to hunt. That's an extreme version of it. Most of us can't do that, but we can make decisions to buy a piece of property and not fragment it on purpose just for financial gain, So anyway, I think that's the one thing that we'll look back on and be proud of.
I think you're 100% right. And it's not a trivial thing either, the impact that has. So there was a study that came out a few years ago that quantified how land is, what uses land is owned or leased. And the study found that about 356 million acres of land across the United States of America is primarily owned or leased for hunting. That's just for hunting. 440 million acres were for wildlife-related recreation. 356 of those were for hunting. So that's about half the sum total that America has of public land. So we have 640 some million acres of federal public land. We've got another 356 million acres of private land now managed for hunting and wildlife. That's good. A huge sum, of wildlife habitat that is being protected and managed for critters that, if we didn't have that, there aren't, as much as I love hiking or backpacking or whatever, like there aren't a pile of people who love to mountain bike who are buying thousands of acres of land to manage to help wildlife.
No.
That's a thing that our community is doing and is keeping a lot of species on the ground and here because of it. So that's a big deal.
I think in the future, in our kids' lives and our grandchildren's lives, one of the most finite resources will be wild places, just places without roads, places without fragmentation, large tracts of land. And you can't get those back. I mean, in the foreseeable future, and I mean, unless our whole civilization just falls and becomes ruins, and people 1,000 years from now dig up our houses from the ground. I mean, you don't get back where a Walmart goes in. You don't get back where a subdivision goes in. I haven't told the world this yet, Mark, but I'll release it on the Wired to Hunt podcast. We're going to do a series on American wilderness. I've been working for a pretty long time on a series on American wilderness, and wilderness like with a capital W.
Capital W.
Federally regulated wilderness, but also the idea of wilderness and how, as Americans, we view that very different from anywhere in the world. And as I've researched, and most of the information is not coming from hunters. I mean, there's a lot of people that are vested in wilderness, but as I read it, I'm like, hey, do y'all realize that like we're the ones who are probably doing more, especially in private lands, for keeping tracts of land intact and adding value to just raw land, probably more than anybody. And it's going to be a really interesting. But
yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah.
Yep. The history of our wilderness preservation system and all of that's fascinating stuff. Did a lot of research into that.
Well, you're an expert. You're an expert on it.
To a degree. And it's very, very interesting. And I agree with you that I think these last places that we have that are relatively wild are about as rare of a resource as you can find today. So I'm all for protecting them. And there's very interesting things between the capital W designation and then the concept and philosophy of wilderness and what all that means to us as a people, to us as hunters, to us to managing resources. I mean, you've got a lot of fodder there for a podcast series. I'm sure it's going to be great.
Yeah.
Have you read the book Wilderness and the American Mind? I think it's called.
Yeah, man. I got it sitting right over here. One of my favorite books.
Yeah, phenomenal.
Really
phenomenal.
Hey, I need to interview you for this podcast for real.
Yeah. Sign me up.
Yeah, deal for real. I want to talk to you. I've got a great. I've already done several interviews with some very interesting people.
Yeah. Well, along those lines, so Wilderness in the American Mind by Roderick Frazier Nash, I think, is the author. That's a recommendation I'll give folks. But now I'm going to throw it back at you on this topic of long hunters and this era that you guys explored in your book. Are there any other books or documentaries or any other kind of resource you would recommend to folks if they want to dive into this world more?
Well, anybody that's been hovering around bear grease at all, or even MeatEater with Steve's stuff, the book Boone by Robert Morgan is really good.
Yep.
There's a book. There's a book called My Father by Nathan Boone, which is Boone's youngest son, who was interviewed when he was 70 years old, 30 years after Boone's death. And it's some of the best insight that we have into Boone. And again, Boone is the primary character that we understand the long hunters from. So that's an incredible book. Yeah, unfortunately, it's all these Boone books, man.
Yeah.
There's a lot. There's Robert Eckert's. The world's gonna be mad at me for not knowing the name of his book. I actually didn't like it, but the Frontiersman, I believe it's called The Frontiersman. I started it and couldn't finish it. People probably be very angry at me for saying that, but that's a very famous book about the era of the long hunters. Ted Franklin Ballou has a lot of work on the long hunters. A lot of the stuff that we research that we got came from different articles and papers that he wrote. But I still got to go with Robert Morgan's Boone. Talks a lot about the long hunters.
Awesome. Last question for you. If someone is listening to this today, obviously they should go out and pick up a copy, download a copy of the Long Hunters book to listen to. But if they want to listen to some bear grease episodes, either about this world or about anything else you're working on now, could you recommend like 1 or 2 bear grease episodes that folks should go listen to if they haven't already?
Well, I'll have to bring up the current episode that came out on January the 10th, which is called The Donnie Baker Story Nightmare. That's the title, and that's part 1. And it is about the illegal killing of a 204-inch buck on the Fort Leonard Wood military base in central Missouri in 2009. Fascinating story. And the most unique thing about it, Mark, is that we interviewed the guy who did it. We didn't interview game wardens. We didn't interview landowners. We didn't interview people in the community. We interviewed the man who committed the crime, which was pretty unique. And it's really, it's a story about the illegal killing of this buck, but really it's a human story more than anything. Just about what this guy, the kind of the mentality this guy had and what he went through and just what it was like killing this deer, trying to hide it, lying about it. And I don't know, it was one of the hardest podcasts I've done because the guy's 40 years old. His name's Donnie Baker. I mean, it's not a secret. And it was a challenge because a lot of times when you're dealing with people that are deceased, I don't know, you just feel a little bit more liberty to say what you think. And in this case, I was very concerned about like crushing this guy, honestly.
Yeah, what are the ramifications of putting that story out there? Yeah.
Even when he agreed to tell the story, I was like, man, let's talk about this. You sure you want to do this? And I think it influenced the way I told the story in a good way. But it's a fascinating story. So the Donnie Baker story. It's a 2-part series. The second part comes out. I don't know when this podcast that we're making right now is going to come out, Mark, but it comes out like January 20th something. The second part comes out, but it's
Perfect.
Really cool. And then our Boone series was good. Holt Collier, Mississippi River. I love them all, Mark.
It's good stuff, man. My son Everett still special requests Clay Newcomb talking about Daniel Boone every once in a while. I'll be driving somewhere, like, let's listen to Clay talk about Boone. I'm like, not again, Everett, please. So keep up the good work, man. You're doing great. I love the things that you're putting out there into the world. I appreciate you, and thank you for coming on and doing this.
Thanks, Mark. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, and that's a wrap. Thank you for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed this conversation, as I always do when me and Clay get together. Good guy, does great work, and this latest audiobook is another great example of that. So I hope you'll check it out. With that in mind, and with that said, thanks for being here. Appreciate you being a part of this community. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, stay wired to hunt.